Welcome to the No More Dead Friends podcast. I am your host, James Evans. We are not affiliated with any 12-step fellowship. If you are interested in meetings, please seek out a local 12-step meeting in your area. If you or a loved one is struggling with addiction and think that you might need treatment, please call 858-790-1937 to see what treatment options are available to you in your area. If you are having a medical emergency, please dial 911. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the No More Dead Friends podcast. I'm your host, James Evans, and I'm here today with my good friend, Chris Haynes. What's going on, Chris?
Not much, just enjoying the day. And I've known you for a while now, James, so it's good to be on the podcast with you tonight.
For sure. It's definitely been a little bit since I've seen you too, so it's awesome to have you on here. You know, I was talking to Kristen just a couple minutes ago because she's driving home. She wanted me to make sure I said hi to you.
Okay.
You know, I know you've known Kristen probably just as long as you've known me.
Mhm.
And for those listening who don't know, Kristen is my wife. And because me and Kristen met after I moved back from Colorado.
Mhm.
So everybody who I had connections with in the program prior to me moving, she was, surprised by a lot of the people when she'd find out after the fact that like I've known these people, and she was just kind of blown away that I was having you on there. She wanted me to say hi, and I was like, yeah, that's my buddy. I remember the Sunday night meeting we used to do over at the Alano Club out here. I used to give you rides home,
Mhm.
on Sundays when you were
Yeah.
living at that sober living house up on Clinton Keith.
Yeah.
So we go way back. That wasn't my last time in the program. I haven't been sober since then.
Mhm.
But shortly after that is when, I got sober and stayed sober. So it's really, really cool to have you on here.
Yeah. And I also remember seeing you at the Monday night meeting. There was a Monday night meeting I remember I used to see you at. And it's also just for me, it's really thinking about those beginnings, like where I came from, like you said, where you used to take me home. I didn't even have a car in my name, didn't even really have a job. And things are a lot different today. And recovery to me is not just about maybe getting material possessions and things like that. It's a lot more, but in a way, it's one aspect of it. But for me, I get to see like where I came from and where I am now. So it's been interesting seeing both of us on this journey. Definitely.
100%. Yeah. And, I know you didn't have a car, and I might have had a car, but it was a falling apart Honda Civic. And, getting sober and staying sober might not necessarily be all about getting the cool things, but, it's
Mhm.
definitely a lot more comfortable to be riding around in a Jeep than it is to be riding around in a falling apart Honda Civic. So,
Yeah.
I'm glad that you've seen me in my bucket days because that's where I come from. But it's so awesome to see where both of us have came today. So
Mhm.
getting kind of into your story, starting out at like childhood, like what did your upbringing look like? What did childhood look like for you? Can
Mhm.
you kind of get into that a little bit?
Sure. And I think what's really might be unique about my story, maybe I'm not as unique as I think, but at least for me, I didn't really grow up in a home where using drugs was encouraged or even really was anything that I saw my parents doing or really any of my family. I remember occasionally I would see like my mom might have had like a glass of wine to drink when we were at dinner, but I never really saw my dad or my mom getting high or drunk growing up. It wasn't really something I was used to. And for me at least, and I didn't want to admit it at first, but I think that I might have grown up in what you might call a more of a sheltered environment. A lot of my upbringing was like going to church a lot, doing stuff like that with a family. It wasn't really, drugs was not really something that was on the horizon for me. It kind of just was something I had heard about before, but it wasn't something I really want to do. I remember I didn't even want to drink when I turned 21. It's sort of just um, growing up was a lot of times with family. We would go to Chicago a lot. You see, I'm wearing this White Sox hat, and we had a second place in Oceanside. We go to the beach a lot. So I didn't really have a troubled childhood. It was fine. I didn't have maybe everything I wanted. I switched schools a lot, but I think for me, maybe being sheltered, maybe being curious. And I've told this story a couple of times. I remember being around 16 years old. I had a friend that lived in the wine countries in Temecula, and it was like maybe it was a late night. I was spending a night at one of my friends' houses, and I went next door because I had two friends that lived close to each other, and I saw my friend. It was like maybe 7 or 8 at night, so he took his shirt off, So it didn't make sense to me. I was like, dude, it's like nighttime and it's cold. It was like September. So it was cold. It was like it wasn't the winter. Summertime. Like, why are you taking your shirt off? And I saw him pull out a cigarette. And he didn't offer me it like right away. He's not like he was trying to peer pressure me. Um, but maybe I was a little curious. So I remember taking a couple of drags off actually it wasn't a cigarette, it was a black and mild. But for me, that was it really it's crazy to think about it now because that was so long ago. But that for me was really a life changer because it really was the thing that really like, I always thought I would never do anything. And
Yeah.
maybe I started later than other people, but being maybe this sort of innocent kid and then, smoking a black and mild at the age of 16, it really kind of was the thing that made me curious about drugs.
For sure. And I think it's important too, for people who have stories that, like you don't need to come from this traumatic,
Mhm.
disastrous past in order for addiction to affect you. It's so many people's problem when they're at something that could have been their bottom. It's always, I was never as bad as this person.
Mhm.
So many people too, they want to like look for differences, right,
Mhm.
rather than the similarities. And one of
Mhm.
those differences could be like, well, I didn't have a traumatic past, like, so many people's stories include that, and I
Mhm.
always like to share because for me, until I might have started a little earlier than you, but my upbringing had nothing to do with why I chose to do the things that I did,
Mhm.
and it's always very important for me to talk about that when I'm telling my story, because it's like, there was really no like excuses. Like, yeah, I had reasons why I felt, uncomfortable, and I was discontent and I was irritable, and I had those things going on, but it wasn't because like something my parents were doing. I wasn't
Mhm.
like locked in a room. I wasn't going without. So, addiction is one of those things that it doesn't discriminate, so, and
Mhm.
it can happen at any time.
Yeah, and yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that too because for me it didn't really, I guess, happen overnight. Like after I had smoked my first black and mild when I was 16, maybe it would happen more frequently. Like maybe every couple of months, me and my friends would go somewhere, and if one of my friends had one, and I remember when I was 17, basically one of my friends' moms was out of town. He basically had the house to himself. We had like a little kickback, so I smoked weed for the first time, and then when my friend told like some of my other friends who had known who I was before, kind of this like Christian guy who was maybe a goody two shoes, maybe a little bit sheltered, that I had smoked weed. It was a surprise.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, wow, really? And some people maybe were disappointed in me. It's like, dude, you gave up your morals. But maybe I was just curious at the time because I don't know about you, James, but sometimes you'll hear people say, like, oh, the first time I smoked weed, it was terrible. I didn't get high. That wasn't my experience at all.
Oh, mine neither. So the first time I smoked weed, I was 11 years old, and
Mm-hmm.
my older buddy who was in eighth grade was like, most people who smoke weed for the first time don't smoke enough so they don't get high.
Mm-hmm.
And mind you, I'm a fat kid, so we smoke a bunch of bowls, we go inside. I had never seen Corky Romano yet, so Corky Romano got put on TV, and I grabbed a bunch of snacks, and I was a fat kid who was just stoned watching Corky Romano, laughing his ass off and
Mm-hmm.
eating snacks. So I
Yeah,
had a blast for my first time.
right, right. And yeah, I mean, I've heard of people like they don't get high. For me, no, like we were around a campfire and I don't know how we all started like tripping out at the same time. And then I can't remember how it happened, but like my friend lost the key to his house. So we like slept in his older brother's like minivan.
Hmm.
So it was just like it was really a trip because I don't know, it was just something I didn't really expect, but it really at that time in my life it really seemed so harmless. It was just we were just getting high, eating lots of Doritos or whatnot. I remember the next time I did it, we were like watching Star Wars or something like that. It really just seemed so harmless, and it really was, at least for I think for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So I had some friends that smoked quite regularly when I was in high school. I would maybe join them here and there, but it wasn't something I did very occasionally until, it was only something I did occasionally for a few more years until I hit about 22. It was around that time where I feel like I didn't really have a whole lot of coping skills. My dad had just told me he had just gotten this surgery that because he had been dealing with some medical health issues that went wrong and he was living in a lot of constant pain. I remember he told me he was thinking about committing suicide. Um, so it was at a point in my life where I was in college and I had a job, but I was dealing with the possibility that I might lose my dad. And he told me he was thinking, but it didn't mean he was going to. But at that time, life just seemed out of loop. So I went from maybe smoking occasionally to like I couldn't live life without it. I thought I was, I guess, quote, functional because I still had a job. I was still going to college. Yeah, my parents were helping me a lot, but I wasn't, I wasn't calling off of work because I wanted to smoke. I wasn't not going to class because I wanted to smoke. But at around the age 22, I started smoking every day. And for a while, it didn't really seem like it was affecting me. I just was spending a lot more money on it than I wanted to. Um,
Yeah.
and maybe you can relate at first where it doesn't seem like it's really a big deal or
Yeah, so like, one thing that I talk about that, I experienced it with weed, and then I experienced it at the end a lot with like meth, where you being super young trying weed, that was kind of the first thing where it's like, oh, this is a bad thing. I try it, and then like the next day I'm sober and I'm fine and nothing crazy
mm-hmm,
happened. There was no real repercussions.
mm-hmm,
And like and then obviously I did everything in the middle there leading up towards the end. But at the end, when I was, doing meth with my drinking so I could stay drinking more, like it was one of those things where like I always saw, you see like the image of like the end of the road tweakers, and they don't got no teeth and all
mm-hmm,
this stuff, and it's like I still got my teeth, like I'm fine. And it wasn't until it's like I'm staying up 5, 6, 7 days at a time and the shadow
mm-hmm.
people are at,
Yeah.
that it really, I could tell it was a problem. At
Mm-hmm,
first it was just like, instead of spending a bunch of money on blow, like I can just take a couple bumps of this and like I'm cool.
mm-hmm,
And so for me, like it was really that like I expected this to be some like really bad thing that I did, and when I did it, it didn't have the immediate repercussions.
mm-hmm.
So I felt like it was fine. And then before I knew it, it was too late.
Yeah, and I can relate to that because I feel like my addiction progressed really within like the pace of maybe like a year. Basically, my story was I was a good college student. I was really into history, and I wanted to maybe teach college or excuse me, teach history at the college level. And some of my professors, would tell me like, "Oh, you're a good student. Your writing is really good," and maybe I let that ego maybe go to my head a little bit. So like in the course of like a year, I'd gone from this kid who had finished college, he was maybe thinking about studying history at the college level. And instead of maybe applying to school or working part-time, and I don't know if it was towards the end of my college, I tried ecstasy for the first time and I loved it. And maybe that was the thing that really opened the floodgates because when I saw what stronger things are out there besides just marijuana, it really kind of I really, because I would take ecstasy and go to a party, there'd be all these girls there, they'd be playing loud music, everything just seems so cool. And I think that was a thing that really kind of made me curious about everything, really. So I had gone from being 22 years old, about to graduate college, thinking about maybe going back to college for more study, was getting good grades. And then after I had really done ecstasy, I really, I ended up working for this sales company for a little bit. And it was bad because there were people there that were like selling pills. And I didn't know what methadone was at the time.
Mhm.
I actually asked my friend if he had ecstasy and he said, I have methadone. I didn't realize it was a completely different drug.
Polar opposite.
Yeah, polar opposite. Definitely not what I really wanted. But basically, like because of this guy I met through a friend, that I basically tried when I was 22 years old, tried like opiates for the first time. Like it was two methadone and two, I think it was Percocet no, probably not Vicodin. It was probably two Percocets. And I remember taking that and like sitting outside of like a Target smoking a cigarette, feel like, oh man, I feel really good. And that was unfortunately a thing for me that really opened the floodgates because maybe at that age, being young, maybe a little bit naive, I was really maybe in a way curious about the lifestyle. I maybe had been this kind of innocent kid, really wanted to see what else was out there. So from there, I really just, even though I was still living at this time, I was living at my parents' house, just I started basically doing pills and I started smoking heroin. And it wasn't something, and I remember the first time I did heroin, it was also kind of like different experience of doing ecstasy, but feeling like the first time I did it was feeling like, oh, this is, everything seems so calm. I remember feeling so confident. I remember going to a bar. This might have been the first time I did it, but I remember just feeling like I had the confidence to talk to any woman I wanted. All the things I thought I wanted in my life at that time. And it didn't seem all bad at first. I remember waking up like drenched in sweat, but feeling like, oh, maybe this is just a side effect. So, and I remember it was on the Super Bowl Sunday. It was a Super Bowl a couple years ago, well, a little longer than a couple years ago, but when the Giants were playing the Patriots the second time, and waking up feeling like I had a headache and feeling like, oh, I need to go smoke some heroin to feel well. So I actually took some money from my dad, and I ended up making the money to pay it back, but feeling like my morals were starting to slip a little bit. But
Yeah.
also feeling like, because it's not like weed. I don't ever remember like having to smoke weed in the morning. So that's just the really how it progressed. So I went from there, and then eventually, shortly after that, like people ran out of heroin, and then just meth was the new thing. So and then I started doing that a lot. So
Yeah.
basically, from 22 being this college student doing well to around 23, like before I went to rehab for the first time, like I was pretty much, doing meth every night. Basically, for a while, I thought it wasn't a problem because I still held down a job. I was working this sales job. Basically, my routine was I would go to work and I would wait for my parents to fall asleep, and I would either ride my bike or I'd just go meet up with my dealer and smoke and, be up all night and fall asleep. In the beginning, I would fall asleep and I wouldn't stay up for like days at a time. It didn't seem like a problem at first, but eventually things just escalated and I ended up going to treatment for the first time.
Yeah, and I ended up going to treatment for the first time when I was 23 also, and with me, I was living under that delusion that I was still holding it down, even though, at the end my
Mhm.
drinking was paired with the meth. And so this is how delusional I was, right? In my mind, if I knew when to stop smoking meth, then that means that I was managing it. So basically I had every Monday and Tuesday off work. So
Mhm.
Sunday, I would get home from work. I would stop at the smoke shop. I would buy one of the oil burners, like a bubble, and
Mhm.
then I'd use it all Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday. And by like the evening on Tuesday, so I knew I could fall asleep in time, I would break the pipe so I wouldn't smoke anymore, yet I'd still be doing some bumps until
Mhm.
I was done, And to me,
Mhm.
that was like managing it. Okay, I won't have a pipe now and and then I'll just drink throughout the rest of the week,
Mhm.
and smoke weed. And to me, like that was like the perfect recipe to manage it. And then of course, like it turned into Wednesday, I was going and buying another pipe, and then it was like, eventually I was just staying up all the time.
Mhm.
But like the just delusionally thinking I'm holding it together because like I still have a car, I'm holding down a job,
Mhm.
things are still semi together.
Yeah, I guess maybe an expression I've heard is I've learned how to smoke crank like a gentleman. And,
Yeah.
maybe I thought I was at one time. It's basically after I went to treatment when I was 23, I stayed clean for about a year. And I relapsed over something in retrospect. I realize it is quite stupid, but I was 24, and I think that I thought I was in love, but I really wasn't, with this woman who was in the program, who's in recovery, but she was very new. And I just think that she was not somebody that was good for me. But, we've all probably chased people that weren't good for us at some point in our life. And when it didn't work out, I mean, it wasn't an excuse to go out after almost a year, but I did. And for me, it was really crazy because I went like, maybe after a day of drinking and went right back to, the old stuff, heroin and methamphetamines. And I went pretty hard for a little while, but then I moved up north. I thought I would do a geographic change, but I wasn't quite ready to surrender, as they call it, or as they might say. So for a while, I was clean up north and basically just only smoked cigarettes. But then eventually I found connections up there. And for a while, like you said, I was working. I would only maybe get high on the weekends. I thought I was holding it down until I really was started calling off work because I didn't want to go to work the next day because I was just too fucked up from the previous night. I didn't want to risk it, type of thing. Even if
Yeah.
it meant looking kind of suspicious, calling out, I'd rather that than come to work all spun out, type of thing.
Yeah, and so how long from when you went to rehab at
Mhm.
23,
Mhm.
how long until you went to rehab the next time, or
Mhm.
did you get clean the next time without going to treatment? What
I
kind of happened there?
so basically, like from when I went to rehab when I was 23, I went to rehab the third time when I was 26, and I've been clean ever since.
Okay.
It's just there was basically like so a rehab when I was 23 for the second time, and then I was clean for almost a year. The first time, I don't know if I'd call it a rehab. Maybe it was kind of a rehab, kind of like a Christian club type of thing. So I'm not sure if I would call that a rehab, but basically the second time, the when I went to rehab when I was 26, after like a couple of years of being in and out, that's when I finally have stayed clean ever since. So that was July 21st of 2015.
Okay.
That's my clean date. So basically, like, the before I went to rehab this last time, everything was just a mess. So I don't think I was under any delusion that I had it together. I had lost my job. I had like, checks were stolen from my mom's house. I had, quit a job. I had everything. I just burned all these bridges basically. And, my mom was really fed up with me, understandably, because, for like a year ago, I was doing fine. But basically, like when I was 26, I had, lost my job. I was like living in a hotel room, hoping to get into a treatment center in
Hmm.
Riverside. And I did. And basically, I think just really at that point, I was just really done. And unfortunately, sometimes people need to go through a lot before they really are done. But eventually, I think once you get there, you realize that, okay, it's time. And, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life once I got, to that point, but I just know I didn't want to get high anymore.
Yeah, yeah, and I share about too a lot of times like I didn't know what exactly I wanted when I came back that second time and I was, actually had surrendered, but I told myself like I don't care what life looks like as long as it doesn't look like it does right now.
Mm-hmm,
And that's where, I kind of subscribe to the idea where it's like we're not in the results game anymore, right? We
mm-hmm,
just suit up and show up and do the next indicated step and we let life take us to where it goes.
mm-hmm,
And I've been blown away at, through the process ever since.
mm-hmm,
But for me, I just knew like, dude, I just don't want to live like this no more. And because at first it was like, my first time going through, I was still holding on to these ideas. I was still holding on to things that like, whether it's recreationally or just like certain things I wanted to participate in and
mm-hmm,
do. It was just very much like stuff that like, yeah, maybe if you have some stability and you got a couple years under your belt, you can put yourself in these situations because if you're there with like the correct reason for being there,
mm-hmm,
or you can handle these things, right? Like even
mm-hmm,
for me, like going to whether it's going to music festivals and stuff like that, and it's like when you got 30, 60 days and you're worried about, going to go see bands play and stuff like that, your focus isn't necessarily where it needs to be. And I'm not
mm-hmm,
telling, anybody who, that's their joy that they can't do it. I just know for me, I couldn't do it, right? Like
mm-hmm.
when I'm focused on that instead of what's in front of me, what I need to be doing, it's not going to work out.
Yeah. And definitely, I agree with you. If you're new in recovery, you only have 30, 60, 90 days. I wouldn't recommend maybe going to a show at first. And eventually you can get to the point where, because sometimes I'll go out places and I'll know people will be drinking and smoking. It doesn't really bother me now that I have 8 years. But when I was new, I remember, so July 21st is my clean date. But I was living in sober living for a little bit over a year, my first year. But I remember it was like around Halloween time. So how many years? So maybe I had around 3 months feeling like I wanted to get high, because I was new in recovery. So if I was in an environment where people were, maybe I would have. Maybe I thought, hey, I just
For
needed to get
sure.
off the hard shit. Maybe I could go back to smoking weed. At that time, I had a job. So, but I'm glad I didn't really do that. And as you said, I didn't know what I wanted my life to look like. I just didn't want any more of what I had received so far. And basically, like I remember sharing when I was in my first year, how it was really for me kind of, I guess, interesting. I'm not sure which adjective to use, but I really had never worked with children before until I got into recovery, and it really wasn't my plan. I was just looking for a job, really, and it was kind of just something that was only part time at first. But I just remember seeing this thing on Craigslist, and I sent in my resume, and I got it. And my first job in recovery involved working with children, and that really led to me going back to school. And as I've been for the past 5 years, I'm a certificated school teacher, and
Yeah, that's awesome.
but it's not always an easy job, but it's been definitely pretty rewarding. And really, I guess now I could talk about all the good stuff of recovery. And it's not really what I thought about going into recovery, but I just wrote down a list since I've been clean. I'm just going to list it off real quick. These are the countries
Okay.
I visited: Mexico, Germany, France, Switzerland, Poland, Armenia, Greece, United Kingdom, Wales, the Isle of Man, Canada. And in 1 month, I'm going to back to Austria and Italy.
That's amazing. Yeah. Do you do any of your travels with Jorge?
I have not. I know that he's
Okay.
been a couple places as well. We actually, when I was in one of my trips, he was also on a trip somewhere else. I think he was Costa Rica. But
Okay.
no, I haven't done a trip with Jorge, but I know he likes to travel as well.
I know he does a ton of the traveling too, you know, there is a period, right, with so you know, I had relapsed. You had obviously stayed clean
Mhm,
since 2015. You know, my clean date's in 2016. And Jorge was one of the guys in the program that at the time had years, you know.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so when I got sober and then I moved to Colorado, you know, there was that period where, you know, I was seeing the cool shit that you guys were doing, you know, and I was just in a halfway house in a new state. Like you know, and that was the type of stuff that like when you're posting photos of doing cool stuff like that on Facebook, it's like, man, this is like people that were who were doing the deal when I was there and I got sidetracked and then like now they're doing cool shit because they have years now and
mhm.
I'm still just kind of putting the pieces together. It was like motivating to see.
Yeah, and that's good. I mean, whatever type of motivation gives you. And I remember kind of feeling like that too, because I'll see people that have multiple years, maybe even multiple decades, who've traveled the whole world over twice and who have gone to far away places. But I guess what I like to think about is the fact that I'd be able to go these places like 7 years ago, or excuse me, 8 years ago, when I was still in the midst of everything that was going on in my addiction. I never thought about going, you know, to a faraway place like Armenia, and the
Yeah,
fact that I would pay for it myself. I remember feeling like going to Hemet from Temecula to go to a casino seemed like a vacation.
for sure.
And I didn't have I don't really feel like I had the guts to end my life myself when I was heavy in my use, because there were times, of course, when I liked, getting high and whatnot. But I just remember just feeling so hopeless. I didn't know what had happened. I had had good opportunities and managed a way to mess them all up. And it's just really, to me, it is kind of amazing that I can get clean and go all these places. And I'm sure my story is not unique. I know plenty of people who have. And it wasn't something that was promised to me when I got clean. That we talk about, like, you'll just learn how to stop using or stop drinking. But I just think that really the benefit of not doing these things is you might be able to do something like that. And I know people that maybe haven't traveled the world, but they, got married and have kids now. And that was something they never thought was going to happen. Or they got a business, or they got their kids back, became a doctor, you name it. I mean, not everybody's story is the same, but I think I've been coming around long enough I've seen a lot of really incredible things.
Yeah, in same here, you know. And one cool thing about when you see people in recovery who do cool things, you know, everybody showed up on day one and nobody got here because they were killing it at life, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some people do get clean where their bottom might not be as low as yours.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people are down and out when they get here. And a lot of people go from down and out to being incredibly successful and doing just amazing things. And no
Mm-hmm.
matter what it is that these people do, there's a formula to get there. Right. And I remember looking back too, like one thing for me is when I was way younger, I always wanted to be a pilot. Right. That was like that was a thing that I really, really wanted to do when I was a kid. Right. And eventually at 11 I was smoking weed and I was like, I'm never going to become a pilot, they're going to drug test me. So it was like never like anything that I ever wanted to do. And
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, fast forward and Dana is taking flight school, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and then Dana's up in the air flying a plane and I'm like, that is so cool to see. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to suddenly be like, okay, I want to become a pilot, right? There's somebody in recovery that I
Mm-hmm.
can talk to and say, hey, how'd you do that? Where'd you get started? And just like somebody takes us through the steps, they can say, oh, it starts here and then follow the formula.
Yeah, and during the time I've been clean, I've experienced a lot of really hard things, a lot of things that I think if I was just abstinent, I don't know if I still would be able to do this. The fact that I've met people who have gone through so many hard things. One of the hardest things I think I've gone through was when I was in year three. A friend of mine, one of my best friends from high school, he died. And we're not sure if his death was a suicide or was an accident. Basically, his car went off the Ortega Highway, and his brother thinks it might have been intentional. I'm not sure 100% if it was or not. I know that he was a special education teacher in San Diego, and there was a lot of really shady things that were going on, and I think the stress from that. But basically, like, he was not an addict. He was just somebody who went to church a lot, very good-hearted man. we disagreed on a few things, but we still stayed in touch, which is really nice because I think in today's environment, a lot of times if you disagree with somebody on something, you like cut the friendship, but that wasn't the case with this individual.
For
We
sure.
disagreed on a lot of things, but we still remained friends. And he basically, yeah, I lost him, and I remember feeling devastated when it happened, but I didn't have to use over it.
Exactly. I mean, the even the name of this podcast, is the No More Dead Friends podcast.
Mhm.
I lost my best friend that, we met in fifth grade on our birthdays at recess. We share the same birthday, and our first conversation was me saying, "Hey, guess what? It's my birthday." And he was like, "No way, it's my birthday too." Best friends ever since, right? But we both ended up doing drugs,
Mhm.
and and we lost him, and I have, sadly, I have a laundry list of friends and people in the program that I've lost, and
Mhm.
so it's not something that's sunshine and rainbows the whole time, right? Like,
Mhm.
life ebbs and flows. Good times don't last and bad times don't last,
Mhm.
but we get to go through these periods of life, and we get to walk through them sober, and we get to show up in our family's life. My father-in-law's in the hospital, and he might not make it out, and the last 10 days we've spent hours of every day, driving all the way out to Riverside and spending the whole day at the hospital. And, I get to show up in my wife's life today.
Mhm.
She's never seen me drink or use. I've never seen her drink or use. This is a part of the deal of getting married, is that when we go through stuff, we show up for each other.
Mhm.
And if I was drinking or using or getting loaded, like, I wouldn't be showing up today like I am.
Mhm.
But I get to do that today for my wife. I want to do that. It's been about 10 days or so that we've been up there every day. And she went up there today for a shorter period of time, and I was like, we're going to be up there for the next 3 days for sure. And so I was just taking one day to just kind of like give myself a break and take care of me. And she was gone this morning, and I was just like looking at our room and the hallway and the area, and it was like an absolute mess. So I'm like cleaning, doing laundry, vacuuming. And normally, like, the washing of the laundry and the vacuuming is what I do, and she kind of does everything else. And it's like I went into the bathroom, deep cleaned the bathroom like she normally does, just so she can like come home tonight, have a clean space. And like, that's not the type of shit that James Evans ever
Mhm.
did for anybody. Like, I remember just like how disgust because my house was always a party house. I remember how disgusting I used to have girls that would be like, "Bro, you got to clean this fucking toilet," right? And they'd be in there fucking cleaning the toilet. And like, that's not who I am today.
Mhm.
And it's amazing to see that process in so many people's lives. Like, this isn't something that's like only happened to me or only happened to you. Like, time and time and time again, people show up and they're assholes, they're pieces of shit, or life is a mess, and they turn it around and they become amazing human beings.
Oh, definitely. I was thinking when you were talking out, like before I got clean, it was really all about me. Like, what can I do? I want to get high. How am I going to get high? That means if I sell something that's not mine, it all revolved around me, really. And the fact that like I could be present in my family's life today. My father passed away a couple of years ago, but I've been able to help. I help my mom out just with little stuff like maybe she's going out of town and she wants me to watch her dog, or she needs me to do the dishes. So I could be this dependable person for her. There was one time, I think I was in maybe my first, or I was early in recovery. I was in like my first or second year, and it was quick, like how she had gotten in a car accident. It wasn't a serious one, but she needed my help, so I basically drove out there and helped her out. And those were stuff that she couldn't depend on me before. Just these little things like that, where I actually genuinely want to be a help, not a nuisance today. If it's something along those lines, helping out my brother, where my family doesn't have to worry about me anymore, like it definitely was the case in the past. And as you said, the name of the podcast, I wrote down, I was thinking just the name No More Dead Friends. I was thinking of people I know who either passed away from drug use and before they reached the age of 30. And I don't think I got all of them, but I got wrote down at least 15 names. And
Yeah.
there's probably more that I know of in our area or in other areas of people who didn't make it to the age of 30 because they were just, unfortunately, this thing, it's not all rainbows. People unfortunately for whatever reason wanted to go back out, or they weren't, I don't know why they did it, but unfortunately, yeah, that's happened. That's something we've had to deal with, and not always young people either, but it really is just a problem, unfortunately. And if we're not careful enough, it can happen to us.
Yeah,
So,
and I was talking about this with somebody the other day, really the both of us, we got sober at like the tail end of where like there were the people in the rooms, which is what I needed to get sober, right? Is I got sober in that environment of men's meetings where it's like, hey, if you're not done, go get done. We're
mhm.
gonna love we don't shoot our wounded. We're gonna love you regardless. But like if you ain't done, go get done, right? And unfortunately today with the fentanyl, like you
Yeah,
can't really be like telling people to
yeah,
go get done, right?
yeah,
Because every single use is it's such a higher risk
mhm.
roll of the dice than it was even 7, 8, 9 years ago,
Oh yeah,
and so it's tough for me where it's like I needed that like tough love approach
mhm.
when I was at that weird age where I was an adult, but I still thought like a child, but I
Mhm.
thought that I had it all figured out. And I I didn't I thought I was so much smarter than I was, but I needed that tough love approach of like, hey, if you're gonna like man up and do this, man up and do this, you
Yeah,
know?
and it's interesting you mentioned that too. Like I remember hearing that expression now, but I feel like it's really a dumb thing to say these days with how, because thinking about it now, like it's weird how back then, and maybe I thought I had the best dealer in the world or whatever, but I never like was thinking like, oh, is this going to be laced with fentanyl, whether it was, crystal or dope or whatever it was. And thinking of like the big lines I would have done before work, like if that was laced with fentanyl, I don't think I would be alive.
Oh,
And
for sure.
it's crazy to think that, maybe I just got lucky, maybe we were using before the fentanyl crisis took off, but that we didn't come across that, because telling someone these days if you're not done to go out and get done, I don't think that's great advice.
I know, and it's so hard where like some people might need that type of approach, but there has to be like a new form of
Mhm,
being able to like get tell people what they need to hear without telling them to go get loaded until they're
mhm.
ready to get clean, you know?
Yeah.
And that's not some like something that I'm definitely not smart enough to figure that out, you know? But I've just learned that like I have to be like even as a sponsor, right? Like making sure people do the work and not necessarily being somebody who's going to be like militant about it,
Mhm,
but definitely, explain things in a way to where they understand like, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to go get loaded again and you're going to die.
mhm.
That because that's really, I mean, I know it's jails, institutions, and death, but death is seeming to be like, the more prominent option out there.
Yeah, and I don't. Problem is too is maybe people, maybe they've been clean for a couple of years, and they think they can do a big shot like they used to, or a big line like they used to, and it just isn't like that. And yeah, I mean, I know people who've done that, and I'm not sure which approach is the best to take, but I think if you baby somebody too much, or if you tell them, hey, it's going to be okay, and without maybe, realizing that, they don't have to have their whole life figured out, in day one, day 30. You don't have to have a new house by 6 months. I think if anything, the most important thing is just don't get high. And then eventually over
Exactly.
time, eventually those things will come. And, I mean, I don't have my own house, but I mean, I got a car, a job, have everything I need. I don't have everything I want. I just went through a breakup, and dating is hard these days in recovery, or if you're not in recovery, just in general.
Yeah.
And and some people also, what it is hard too for new people, when they're new, they might see a newcomer that they think is all that in a bag of chips. I did that when I was new the first time, and that's a really risky situation, because sometimes what happens is if one person goes out in the relationship, the other one follows.
I had done that my first time around, the Friday night meeting that I got taken to in the druggy buggy. I thought the chip chick was hot, and so when I got out of treatment, I started following around the chip chick, and then there you go. End up dating her for, this next 6, 7 months that I'm sober, and then eventually it doesn't work out for me. and because I was focused on the wrong thing, right? And so when I came back, I didn't date for the first year. And then around a year and a half is when I had met Kristen, who she had 90 days, and she came over and she never went home. So, and she's been sober for a little over about almost 6.5 years, and I have about 7.5 years, so it worked for her, but like it very easily could have not worked for her.
Hmm.
It was one of those things where, like, we both did the work.
Hmm.
That's really what it boils down to. And with my story with moving to Colorado, I had zero plan when I moved to Colorado. I filled up my fallen apart Honda Civic, and I had $500, and I drove there without a job. I had a couch to sleep on. I spent a chunk of that money on gas on the way out there.
Hmm.
Um, and I just figured it out, but I did what I was supposed to do. I went to meetings. I did the work. I realized when, like, hey, I don't like the meetings on this side of town, but I like the meetings on this side of town. I
Hmm.
should probably move into a sober living on this side of town instead of sleeping on my buddy's couch.
Hmm.
And it's like, if I hadn't done those things, I wouldn't be here today.
Hmm.
And if Kristen, when she was doing things that might have been perceived as the wrong way of doing things, if she wasn't still going to meetings, doing the steps and doing the deal, she probably wouldn't be here today. So it doesn't need to look perfect, but you
Hmm.
got to stay moving. You got to do the work.
An expression I've heard is like the only thing you have to do perfectly is you just don't use. I mean, you're going, obviously, you don't want to stay clean and sober and live dirty. There's
Yeah.
somebody who I knew who was in the program, had multiple years, that he was like hooking up with newcomers and doing whatever he had to do just to get the next relationship or have sex and things like that. And people who have been clean who have done bad things. And of course, that's something they have to deal with. But the most important thing is you just don't use. And
Yep.
you need to be careful. I think if you're new and you're maybe looking for a relationship, it can be tough, but definitely relationships with people in recovery that both work their steps, that can be very helpful and very healthy. It's just, I think that you gotta, and it's often suggested you don't get in a relationship your first year. It doesn't say it anywhere, it's not like in any of the literature, or it's recommended, but I think it's a good recommendation. I mean, not
For
everyone
sure.
follows it,
It's
but
for sure. It's for sure a good recommendation. I mean,
mm,
it's just one of those things where, if you don't know yourself and you don't know how to show up in your own life, how are you going to show up for somebody else? So
yeah.
it makes sense, but not everybody follows it,
Yeah.
so, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't.
Hmm.
And like for me, I don't always feel the need today to prove that I'm the exception to a rule.
Hmm.
Some people stop doing heroin and they're able to just smoke weed and
Yeah.
drink, and then
Yeah.
life's fine. And I
Hmm.
I tried that, but I never was successful.
Hmm.
Right. And so, today I'm not tempted to go just smoke weed and drink, because every time I tried to do it, it led back to what I like to do the most. And so
Hmm.
today I don't need to prove that, like, oh, I could be this exception to the rule. I'd be able to do these things and be fine today. I might for a little bit, but
Hmm.
I know my track record. It shows that I go back to what I liked the most, and I don't need to, like, prove to myself today that, like, I can try and pull this off.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. Like you said, some people might be able to do that. And I know people who have done that. It's just a very risky thing to do. You don't know what could happen potentially.
Yeah.
And some people I know don't have never really had to go to meetings. I personally, if I don't go to meetings, I get a little crazy. I get
Yep.
really ramped up in my head. And it's just for me also, I've made a lot of good friends in recovery. A lot of my friends are in recovery. But I have some friends that aren't, and I have some friends that drink and smoke. They don't do it around me, but it is what every person's got to find their own individual path. I don't think there's a one size fits for all. Some people I know have went to Celebrate Recovery, which I don't know if you're familiar with it at all. It's like a Christian version
Yeah,
of
I know Celebrate
recovery.
Recovery.
And yeah, and then some people maybe just didn't go to meetings at all and they just haven't used it in a long time. And I guess to each his or her own. But for me, just going to meetings has been the really thing that's helped me get almost over 8 years. Thing that's kind of really helped me get a career and helped me travel the world. So
Yeah.
uh, that's been my story really, and it hasn't always been easy, but that's basically yeah, that's how I've how I'm a guest on your show today.
Yeah, exactly. Right on. Well, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you coming on here and telling your story. It's great to see you.
Mhm.
Even though it's virtual, it's
Yeah.
awesome to be face to face with you, because it's definitely been a while since I've seen you, since you
Mhm.
moved up north with
Mhm.
work. And you were a huge part in the beginning, man. Even though it might seem simple, but and a lot of times people too, you might feel like you're a burden on somebody asking them for a ride home.
Mhm.
But it was the opposite, man. Those meetings after the meeting, and just even
Mhm.
there's the whole TED talk on the opposite of addiction is connection,
Mhm.
and building the connection, and the camaraderie with the people in the program is such a huge element. And especially for where I was at the time, where I needed things to help me buy into the program, and even just spending, 20 minutes after the meeting giving somebody a ride home. That's just one of those things that, when I did pick up again, that's the type of stuff that brought me back, because it was like I needed that connection and those people to be around. So I really do appreciate you being on here, and it really is good to see you.
All right, James. Great seeing you, and thanks for having me on tonight.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. See ya.
All right, later.
Thank you for listening to the No More Dead Friends podcast. I'm your host, James Evans. We are not affiliated with any 12-step fellowship. If you are interested in meetings, please seek out a local 12-step meeting in your area. If you or a loved one is struggling with addiction and think that you might need treatment, please call 858-790-1937 to see what treatment options are available to you in your area. If you are having a medical emergency, please dial 911. For information about our clothing line, please go to nomoredeadfriends.etsy.com. The No More Dead Friends podcast is made for educational, promotional, and entertainment purposes. It is essential to understand that the topics discussed in this podcast are based on general knowledge and are not to be considered as professional treatment advice. Please consult with qualified medical professionals before making any decisions or taking any actions based on the information in this podcast.